Good evening, friends, and welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the stories of remarkable lives, some noble, some tragic, all unforgettable. Tonight, we journey to a nation divided, a young America torn apart by war, slavery, and the weight of its own ideals. The year is 1861. The air hums with tension. The streets buzz with debate. And at the center of it all stands a man whose name would become synonymous with courage, wisdom, and sacrifice: Abraham Lincoln. Before we begin, a quick thought. If these quiet reflections on history's giants help you unwind, please consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps others discover these stories too. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Which leader would you like us to explore next? Let us know in the comments below. To speak Lincoln's name is to summon images of a towering figure, his face etched with the sorrow of war, his words ringing with moral clarity. But beneath the legend was a man of humble beginnings, a log cabin, a borrowed book, a mind sharpened by struggle. His story is one of relentless perseverance, of a self-taught lawyer who rose to steer a fractured nation toward its better angels. History remembers his triumphs: the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, the preservation of the Union. But tonight, we're not just here for the speeches or the victories. We're here to meet the man, the father who grieved lost sons, the leader who doubted yet endured, the weary soul who carried a country's hopes on his shoulders. And now, as the evening settles in, let's trace the life of a man who believed a house divided could not stand, yet dared to rebuild it. This is the Bedtime Biography of Abraham Lincoln. Chapter 1: A Humble Kentucky Dawn. Our story unfolds in the Kentucky backcountry during the early, rather brisk months of 1809. Abraham Lincoln made his debut on February 12th. His first earthly home was a simple log cabin, nestled on a piece of land known as Sinking Spring Farm. You might picture this region as the American frontier in its raw youth, a sprawling canvas of ancient forests where settlers, with considerable effort, were etching out their lives. For these pioneers, existence was often a straightforward dialogue with necessity, a blend of stark challenges and an unshowy, quiet resolve. The nation itself, remember, was still young then, barely a few decades into its grand experiment. That cabin, young Abraham's first shelter, was a practical response to the demands of the era. Imagine a single room, built from sturdy, rough-hewn logs gathered from the nearby woods. The floor beneath their feet was likely packed earth, a direct connection to the land itself. A stone fireplace would have been the cabin's warm heart, essential for both cooking the daily meals and chasing off the persistent chill. Light, a precious commodity, would have found its way in through a small window, perhaps covered with oiled paper rather than glass, offering a somewhat hazy view of the world outside. It was, in essence, a dwelling built for endurance, not for elegant display. Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, was a man well acquainted with physical labor and the unyielding nature of the frontier. A farmer by trade, he also turned his hand to carpentry when opportunities arose, endeavoring to provide for his family. As was common for many settlers pushing westward, Thomas relocated his family a few times during Abraham's earliest years. His quest was often for more fertile land or perhaps a more secure legal hold on his property, a familiar narrative of hope and restless movement. Thomas knew the unglamorous, steady effort required to persuade the earth to yield a living. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, Abraham's mother, comes to us through historical accounts as a woman of gentle character and a quiet, thoughtful intelligence. Though her life was undoubtedly shaped by the era's hardships, descriptions hint at a reflective soul. It's widely believed Nancy possessed the valuable skill of literacy, a true distinction when formal education was a rarity. One can imagine her sharing stories or the rhythms of language with young Abraham, perhaps planting early seeds of his lifelong love for words. Though her time with him was brief, her gentle influence is often noted as a key element in his formative years. For the infant Abraham, life within that Kentucky cabin was an elemental experience, stripped to its core. You won't find tales of elaborate nurseries or an abundance of toys. His earliest world was woven from the fundamental sensations, the comforting warmth radiating from the hearth, the pervasive scent of wood smoke clinging to the air, and the feel of simple, homespun cloth. The daily soundtrack would have been the soft murmur of his parents' voices, mingling with the diverse, often untamed, sounds of the wilderness that began just beyond their cabin door. These were his first, unfiltered lessons in what it meant to be. The immense wilderness that enveloped their small homestead was a powerful, if silent, instructor. Towering forests loomed nearby. Clear streams meandered through the landscape, and the presence of wildlife was an accepted part of daily existence. Growing up amidst such untamed nature would naturally hone a child's senses and their capacity for observation. The distinct procession of the seasons brought its own clear teachings. The subtle tracks of animals, the practical uses of various plants, the telltale signs of an approaching storm. This was knowledge absorbed directly from the world itself, fostering a deep, practical wisdom. In the year 1809, the United States was still very much in the process of forging its national identity. For those inhabitants on its western fringes, like the Lincolns in Kentucky, the grand pronouncements and political machinations of the federal government in distant Washington could seem worlds away. Frontier communities were often characterized by their small size and a necessary self-reliance. Yet this also fostered a strong sense of interdependence. Neighbors relied on one another for mutual assistance with major undertakings, knowing that collective effort was often crucial for survival and modest advancement. News from the broader nation traveled at a ponderous pace, so the immediate concerns of local life usually held sway. This, then, was the environment that cradled Abraham Lincoln's first years. It was undoubtedly a life of considerable material simplicity, defined by the relentless demands and unvarnished realities of a frontier existence. However, it is often in such challenging circumstances that certain strengths of character are deeply forged. Resilience in the face of adversity, a practical ingenuity born of necessity, and a profound understanding of the everyday struggles of ordinary folk. These were the quiet lessons of his Kentucky upbringing. The uncomplaining fortitude of people building lives against a backdrop of hardship was a powerful example. These formative experiences would remain with him, profoundly shaping his worldview and his enduring empathy for the common person. Chapter 2: Indiana Trials and a Mother Lost. The Lincoln family's time in Kentucky eventually drew to a close. Around 1816, when young Abraham was just 7 years old, Thomas Lincoln decided to move his family north. They crossed the wide Ohio River, venturing into the newer, even less settled territory of Indiana. Land titles in Kentucky had proven persistently troublesome for Thomas, a common frustration for many early settlers. Indiana, then a raw and densely wooded frontier, seemed to offer a fresh start, a new chance to stake a claim and build a more secure future. This move marked another significant chapter in Abraham's formative years. Their new home was in Perry County, specifically in an area known as Little Pigeon Creek. Here, Thomas Lincoln once again set about the arduous task of carving a farm from the wilderness. This meant clearing thick forests, building another log cabin, and preparing the land for crops. Life in Indiana continued the themes of hard physical labor and close reliance on the natural environment that Abraham had known in Kentucky. The days were long, filled with the demands of felling trees, splitting rails, plowing, planting, and hunting. Young Abraham, growing taller and stronger, was expected to contribute his share of the work alongside his father. The Indiana frontier was, in many ways, even more isolated than their Kentucky home had been. Neighbors were often few and far between. The forest was a constant, dominating presence, full of wildlife, both wondrous and dangerous. For young Abraham, these years were an immersion in the very essence of pioneer life. He learned the practical skills necessary for survival: how to handle an axe with increasing proficiency, how to navigate the woods, and how to understand the subtle signs of the natural world. These were lessons not found in books, but etched into experience. However, this period in Indiana was also marked by profound tragedy. In 1818, when Abraham was only 9 years old, a terrible illness known as milk sickness swept through their small community. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, Abraham's mother, contracted the disease and, after a short and painful illness, she passed away. This was a devastating blow to the young boy. The loss of his mother, who had been a source of gentleness and perhaps his earliest intellectual encouragement, left an indelible mark on his sensitive nature. The grief was immense, casting a long shadow over his childhood. The death of Nancy created a harsh new reality for the Lincoln household. Thomas was left to care for 9-year-old Abraham and his older sister, Sarah, in an already challenging environment. The cabin must have felt emptier, the future more uncertain. Abraham took on additional responsibilities, and the weight of their loss undoubtedly matured him beyond his years. This period also saw him begin to turn more earnestly towards books, perhaps seeking solace or understanding in the written word during a time of such personal sorrow. About a year after Nancy's death, Thomas Lincoln traveled back to Kentucky. He returned with a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow whom he had known from his earlier years there. Sarah, or Sally as she was often called, brought her own 3 children to the Lincoln cabin. Her arrival brought significant changes to the household. She was a kind, practical, and energetic woman who brought a renewed sense of order and warmth to their rustic home. For Abraham, his new stepmother proved to be a true blessing. Sally Johnston recognized and encouraged young Abraham's burgeoning intellect and his powerful desire to learn. Unlike his father, who was largely indifferent to formal education, Sally saw the spark in her stepson. She ensured he had access to what few books could be found in their remote community. She fostered his habit of reading by the fireside late into the night, long after the day's demanding chores were done. It was said that Abraham would borrow any book he could get his hands on, reading and rereading them until their contents were thoroughly absorbed. Works like The Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, and Weems' Life of Washington became his cherished companions. Formal schooling for Abraham was sporadic and very limited. Frontier Indiana offered few opportunities for structured education. Teachers were often itinerant, and schoolhouses were rudimentary, if they existed at all. Abraham himself later remarked that his total schooling did not amount to 1 year, yet his hunger for knowledge was immense. He practiced his letters and arithmetic on any surface he could find, a wooden shovel, the back of a board, using charcoal as his pencil. His self-education became his true path to learning, a testament to his remarkable determination and intellectual curiosity amidst the privations of frontier life. This period of loss and learning in Indiana was crucial in shaping the resilient, thoughtful, and increasingly self-aware young man Abraham was becoming. Chapter 3. A Young Man Ventures Forth. As Abraham grew from a lanky boy into a remarkably tall and strong young man in Indiana, the world beyond Little Pigeon Creek began to beckon. The relentless farm labor had certainly built his physique. He was known for his skill with an axe and his surprising physical power. Yet his mind, equally active, yearned for experiences and knowledge beyond the confines of their frontier homestead. The late 1820s saw him beginning to test the waters of independence, taking on jobs that offered glimpses of a wider society and different ways of life. One of his earliest significant ventures came when he was around 19 years old. He was hired by a local merchant named James Gentry to help take a flatboat loaded with produce down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. This was an arduous and sometimes dangerous journey of many hundreds of miles. For a young man who had known little beyond the woods of Indiana, this trip was a profound eye-opener. He would have encountered a bustling world of commerce, diverse cultures, and the unsettling reality of slavery as he witnessed it firsthand in the southern port city. The journey itself, navigating the powerful currents and avoiding river hazards, demanded resourcefulness and courage. These early experiences on the river likely broadened Abraham's understanding of the country's geography and its varied peoples. It also provided him with a small taste of economic independence. Upon his return from New Orleans, the Lincoln family was preparing for another move, this time westward to Illinois. Prompted by fresh concerns about land claims and perhaps the lure of richer prairie soil, in 1830, the Lincolns settled in Macon County, Illinois. Abraham, now 21, helped his father establish this new farm, but his own ambitions were beginning to point him in a different direction. Not long after the move to Illinois, Abraham decided to strike out on his own. His path led him in 1831 to the small, burgeoning village of New Salem, situated on the Sangamon River. This marked a pivotal transition in his life. New Salem was a small but lively community, a collection of cabins, a mill, a store, and a tavern. It was a place where a young man with talent and ambition could make his mark, and Abraham, with his engaging personality and native intelligence, quickly did. In New Salem, Abraham took on a variety of jobs, showcasing his versatility and his willingness to work. He worked as a clerk in Denton Offutt's general store, where his honesty and good humor made him popular with customers. It was during this time that stories of his integrity, like walking miles to return a few cents to an overcharged customer, began to build his reputation as Honest Abe. He also worked as a postmaster, which gave him the opportunity to read newspapers from across the country, further expanding his awareness of political issues and current events. Later, he also tried his hand at being a partner in a general store, an enterprise that unfortunately failed, leaving him with debts that took him many years to repay. His physical prowess found an outlet too. He famously wrestled a local champion, Jack Armstrong, to a draw, an event that further solidified his standing among the sometimes rough-and-tumble residents of New Salem. But it wasn't just his strength or his diligence that impressed people. Abraham possessed a remarkable gift for storytelling. He could captivate listeners with his humorous anecdotes, his thoughtful observations, and his clear way of explaining complex ideas. This ability to connect with people through language would become a hallmark of his later career. It was also in New Salem that Abraham first dipped his toe into the world of politics. Encouraged by local acquaintances who recognized his potential, he ran for a seat in the Illinois state legislature in 1832. Though he was defeated in this first attempt, he made a strong showing for a newcomer with little formal backing. Undeterred, he continued to cultivate his skills and knowledge. He undertook the study of grammar to improve his speaking and writing. Recognizing the need for a more stable profession, he also began to study law in his spare time, borrowing books and teaching himself the principles of jurisprudence. He also worked as a deputy surveyor for the county, a job that required precision and further familiarized him with the land and its people. These years in New Salem were immensely formative. Abraham was no longer just a farmhand. He was becoming a respected member of a community, a man known for his intellect, his character, and his burgeoning ambitions. He was learning about human nature, about commerce, about the workings of society, and about the art of public discourse. The raw frontier boy was steadily transforming into a self-made man, laying the groundwork for the extraordinary path that lay ahead, a path that would lead him far beyond the small village on the Sangamon. Chapter 4. Love, Loss, and a Prairie Lawman. Life in New Salem during the 1830s was not solely about work and public ambition for young Abraham Lincoln. Like any young man, he experienced the stirrings of the heart, forming friendships and, according to local lore and later accounts, experiencing romantic attachments that brought both joy and profound sorrow. These personal experiences, often tinged with a certain melancholy that seemed a part of his disposition, further shaped his character during these crucial years of self-discovery and early adulthood. One of the most enduring, though somewhat mythologized, stories from this period concerns Anne Rutledge. She was the daughter of the New Salem tavern keeper, described as intelligent and comely. Abraham and Anne were said to have developed a deep affection for each other, with some accounts suggesting they were engaged to be married. Tragically, Anne fell ill, likely with typhoid fever, and died in the summer of 1835 at the young age of 22. Her death reportedly plunged Abraham into a period of intense grief, a deep depression that caused his friends to worry for his well-being. The precise nature and depth of Abraham's relationship with Anne Rutledge are subjects of some historical debate, as contemporary evidence is scarce and many accounts were embellished years later. However, it seems clear that her loss affected him deeply, perhaps reinforcing a pre-existing tendency towards bouts of melancholy that would surface at various points throughout his life. This experience with such a personal tragedy likely deepened his empathy and his understanding of human suffering, qualities that would later resonate in his leadership. A few years later, Abraham had another notable romantic involvement, this time with a young woman from Kentucky named Mary Owens. She was visiting her sister in New Salem. By some accounts, there was an understanding, perhaps even a half-hearted proposal from Abraham, but the relationship ultimately did not lead to marriage. His letters from this period reveal a certain awkwardness and uncertainty in matters of romance, a contrast to his growing confidence in public and professional spheres. He seemed to wrestle with his own feelings and his perceptions of what a partner might expect or deserve. Alongside these personal trials and developments, Abraham was making steady progress in his professional aspirations. His self-directed study of law was bearing fruit. He pored over borrowed law books, such as Blackstone's Commentaries, often reading late into the night after a long day of other work. His determination was remarkable. He would reportedly walk miles to borrow a book, and his ability to absorb and understand complex legal principles largely on his own was a testament to his powerful intellect and unwavering focus. In 1836, he achieved a significant milestone. He passed the bar examination and received his license to practice law. This qualification marked a major turning point. Law was a respected profession, one that offered a path to greater influence and financial stability than his previous occupations. It also aligned perfectly with his skills in logic, argument, and communication. Shortly after becoming a lawyer, in 1837, Abraham made the decision to leave New Salem. The village, though formative, was small and offered limited prospects for an ambitious young attorney. He chose to move to Springfield, which had recently been named the new state capital of Illinois, a place brimming with opportunity. In Springfield, Abraham initially partnered with John T. Stewart, an established lawyer and fellow Whig politician who had encouraged his legal studies. Later, he would form partnerships with Stephen T., Logan, and then William Herndon. As a lawyer, Abraham quickly gained a reputation for his honesty, his thorough preparation, and his effectiveness in court. He handled a wide variety of cases, from disputes over land and livestock to criminal defense. Much of his early practice involved riding the circuit, traveling by horseback with other lawyers and judges to various county seats when court was in session. This itinerant life was demanding, involving long journeys and stays in rustic taverns, but it also kept him in close contact with ordinary people across a wide swath of Illinois. His courtroom style was often characterized by its clarity, its logical force, and its use of plain language and relatable analogies that juries could easily understand. He was known for his ability to concede minor points to his opponents, thereby building credibility before focusing with great effect on the core issues of his case. While he could be a formidable opponent, he also earned respect for his fairness and his efforts to mediate disputes and avoid unnecessary litigation whenever possible. The Prairie was shaping not just a man, but a distinct kind of lawyer, one whose character was as much a part of his practice as his legal knowledge. Chapter 5. Springfield beckons a rising star. The move to Springfield in 1837 was a decisive step for Abraham Lincoln, then a young man of 28. New Salem had been a crucial training ground, a place where he had found his footing and discovered his talents. But Springfield, as the newly designated state capital of Illinois, pulsed with a different kind of energy. It was a hub of political activity, legal practice, and social ambition, offering a much larger stage for a man of his abilities and aspirations. Here, among a growing population of lawyers, politicians, and merchants, Abraham would truly begin to forge his career and public identity. Upon arriving in Springfield, one of Abraham's immediate needs was to establish his law practice. He was fortunate to be taken under the wing of John T. Stewart, a prominent lawyer and Whig politician. Stewart, who had previously encouraged Abraham's legal studies, offered him a partnership. This provided the newcomer with an immediate entry into the Springfield legal community. Their office quickly became a busy place, handling a diverse array of cases that reflected the concerns of a developing society: land disputes, debt collections, criminal matters, and more. Abraham's reputation as a capable and honest attorney began to grow. Springfield in the late 1830s and 1840s was a lively, if somewhat raw, frontier capital. Its streets were often muddy, and its amenities were still developing. But it was a place where important connections were made and political fortunes were shaped. The sessions of the state legislature brought lawmakers, lobbyists, and citizens with various interests to the town, creating a vibrant atmosphere of debate and maneuvering. Abraham, already having served a term in the legislature representing Sangamon County, elected while still in New Salem, was a known figure in these circles. He was re-elected several times, becoming a key member of the Long Nine, a group of Whig legislators from Sangamon County, known for their tall stature and their successful efforts to have Springfield chosen as the capital. His service in the Illinois legislature was a significant part of his political education. He was deeply involved in debates over internal improvements, such as the development of roads, canals, and railroads, which were seen as crucial for the state's economic progress. He also took positions on banking issues and other matters of public policy. He learned the arts of negotiation, compromise, and legislative strategy. While not yet the polished orator he would become, his clear reasoning and homespun sincerity were already making an impression. It was also in Springfield that Abraham's social life took a new turn. He was introduced to a different circle of society than he had known in New Salem. Among the notable figures he encountered was Mary Todd, a well-educated and spirited young woman from a prominent Lexington, Kentucky, slaveholding family. Mary was visiting her sister, who was married to Ninian Edwards, a son of a former Illinois governor. Mary was vivacious, intelligent, and politically astute, but also known for her sometimes volatile temperament. The courtship of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd was a complex affair, marked by periods of intensity, doubt, and even a temporary breaking off of their engagement. Abraham himself seemed to wrestle with anxieties about his suitability as a husband for a woman of Mary's background and social standing. He was keenly aware of his own humble origins and his ongoing struggles with debt from his New Salem store. Despite these hesitations and the concerns of some of Mary's relatives about Abraham's rougher edges, the two were eventually married in November 1842. Their marriage would be a long and complex one, bringing both profound partnership and deep personal sorrows. Mary's belief in Abraham's potential was unwavering, and she played an important role in encouraging his ambitions. However, their differing temperaments and the later tragedies they would endure, including the loss of 3 of their 4 sons, would place immense strain on their relationship. In these early Springfield years, though, they established a home and started a family, with their first son, Robert Todd Lincoln, being born in 1843. Professionally, Abraham continued to rise. After his partnership with Stuart, he joined forces with Stephen T. Logan, considered one of the finest legal minds in Illinois. This partnership further honed Abraham's legal skills, particularly in meticulous case preparation and precise legal reasoning. Later, he would establish his longest-lasting partnership with William H. Herndon, a younger man who admired him greatly. By the mid-1840s, Abraham Lincoln was a respected lawyer, an experienced legislator, and a recognized figure in Illinois Whig politics. Springfield had indeed provided the fertile ground for his star to begin its ascent. Chapter 6. A Lone Whig in Washington. After years of dedicated work in Illinois law and state politics, Abraham Lincoln set his sights on a larger stage, the United States Congress. In 1846, he successfully secured the Whig nomination and was subsequently elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. This notable achievement marked his first, and as events would later unfold, his only term in national office before his presidency. In the autumn of 1847, accompanied by his wife Mary and their 2 young sons, Robert and Eddie, he made the journey to Washington, D.C. The nation's capital was a world away from the familiar surroundings of Springfield, a place with more entrenched political traditions and far more intense national debates. One of the most significant issues consuming the political oxygen in Washington at that particular time was the ongoing Mexican-American War, which had commenced in 1846. President James K. Polk, a Democrat, ardently championed the war. He presented it as a necessary and just response to Mexican aggression, and also as a fulfillment of America's manifest destiny to expand its territorial domain westward. However, the conflict was deeply divisive across the nation. Many Whigs, and Abraham Lincoln counted himself among them, regarded the war with considerable skepticism and concern. They questioned its true necessity and harbored suspicions that it was largely an endeavor to acquire new territories into which the institution of slavery could expand, thereby, unfortunately, increasing the political power of the Southern states. Once he took his seat in Congress, Representative Lincoln did not hesitate to make his opposition to the war, or at least to the Polk administration's justifications for it, quite clear. He was particularly critical of President Polk's assertion that hostilities had begun when Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. In December of 1847, Lincoln introduced a series of pointed resolutions that soon became known as the Spot Resolutions. These resolutions persistently and publicly questioned President Polk, urging him to identify the precise spot where American blood had first been shed. This was a direct challenge to the administration's claim that the conflict had legitimately begun on U.S. territory. While the Spot Resolutions certainly demonstrated Lincoln's keen legal mind and his personal courage in directly challenging a popular wartime president, they were not universally well received, even by some folks back in his home state of Illinois. Some of his constituents viewed his critical stance as unpatriotic, and he consequently faced a measure of criticism in newspapers. For Abraham Lincoln, however, it was a deeply felt matter of principle. He was questioning what he saw as executive overreach and probing the moral implications of the war itself. His experience with this contentious issue clearly highlighted the complexities and often harsh realities of national politics, where taking a principled stand could invite significant public backlash and misunderstanding. Beyond the immediate controversies of the Mexican-American War, Lincoln's term in Congress also exposed him much more directly to the escalating and deeply troubling national debate over slavery. The question of whether slavery would be permitted in any new territories that might be acquired from Mexico was an incredibly contentious one, threatening to tear at the fabric of the Union. He gave his support to the Wilmot Proviso, a legislative proposal that aimed to stipulate that slavery should be firmly barred from any such newly acquired territories. Though the proviso repeatedly failed to pass the Senate, its recurring introduction was a clear indication of the growing anti-slavery sentiment in the northern states. Lincoln also, at one point, drafted a bill for the gradual compensated emancipation of enslaved people in the District of Columbia, though this too failed to gain sufficient traction to become law. Despite his active participation on these major and often volatile issues, Abraham Lincoln's single term serving in the House of Representatives was, by his own later and candid estimation, somewhat unremarkable in terms of tangible legislative achievements. He was, after all, a freshman congressman hailing from a still developing frontier state, often a lone Whig voice among many more established figures. He diligently delivered speeches, served on various committees, and attended to the specific needs and requests of his constituents back in Illinois. But he did not emerge as a dominant or commanding national figure during this particular period. He reportedly experienced a sense of ineffectiveness at times, a frustrating feeling that his contributions were not making a truly significant impact on the grand and often turbulent stage of national affairs. It had been something of a Whig tradition in his particular congressional district in Illinois to rotate the nomination, thereby allowing different qualified individuals an opportunity to serve. In keeping with this established understanding, and perhaps also influenced by his own personal sense of limited accomplishment or impact while in Washington, Lincoln did not seek re-election. in 1848. He did, however, actively campaign for Zachary Taylor, the Whig presidential candidate that year. He had harbored some hope for a significant federal appointment, specifically as Commissioner of the General Land Office, following Taylor's victory. However, this coveted appointment ultimately did not materialize. He was instead offered the governorship of the distant Oregon Territory, a position which, after careful consideration, he chose to decline. So, in 1849, after his term in Congress officially ended, Abraham Lincoln returned to Springfield and to the familiar demands of his law practice. His time spent in Washington, though perhaps not fulfilling all his initial political ambitions, had undeniably been an education. It had provided him with a valuable first-hand perspective on the intricate workings of the federal government, the sheer intensity of national debates, particularly concerning the omnipresent issue of slavery, and the formidable challenges inherent in trying to achieve meaningful change on that larger, more complex stage. While possibly feeling a degree of disappointment with his congressional career, he returned to Illinois enriched with new perspectives and a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the powerful forces that were shaping and increasingly threatening the Union he held so dear. Chapter 7. The Wilderness Years Rekindled. Following his return to Springfield in 1849, Abraham Lincoln re-immersed himself with characteristic diligence into his legal career. The subsequent years, stretching forward into the early 1850s, are sometimes retrospectively referred to by historians as his political wilderness years. Having completed his single term in Congress and not immediately pursuing another elective office on the national stage, he focused his considerable energies primarily on the practice of law. This period, however, was far from being a quiet or unproductive interlude in his life. It was, in fact, a time of significant professional growth, continued intellectual development, and quiet observation, even as the nation itself was almost imperceptibly inching ever closer to a profound and unavoidable crisis. Lincoln's reputation as a highly skilled, meticulously prepared, and eminently trustworthy lawyer continued to solidify throughout Illinois. He, along with his junior partner William Herndon, who greatly admired Lincoln, built one of the most successful and respected legal practices in the state. Abraham was particularly renowned for his extensive work on the Eighth Judicial Circuit. This demanding role required him to travel extensively by horse and buggy, alongside judges and fellow lawyers, to various county seats twice each year when court was in session. This itinerant lifestyle, while often challenging, kept him in constant and direct contact with a wide and diverse array of people: hard-working farmers, ambitious merchants, skilled artisans, and fellow members of the bar. It allowed him to listen to their varied concerns, understand their unique perspectives, and further hone his already remarkable ability to connect with ordinary citizens on a human level. His legal casework during these years was incredibly varied and reflected the broad spectrum of issues facing a developing society. He handled everything from relatively small debt collections and complicated land title disputes to more complex cases involving business contracts, emerging patent law, and serious criminal defense matters. One particular area where he became especially prominent was in litigation involving the burgeoning railroad industry. As iron horses began to rapidly expand their reach across the prairies of Illinois and indeed the entire nation, they brought with them a host of novel legal challenges. These often related to land acquisition for rights of way, the interpretation of corporate charters, questions of liability, and the regulation of this powerful new form of transport. Lincoln represented railroads in several significant cases, showcasing his legal acumen, but he also conscientiously took cases against them when justice required, underscoring his unwavering commitment to the fair application of the law rather than to any particular special interest group. These railroad cases were often quite lucrative, and they further enhanced his growing reputation for thorough preparation and clear, persuasive argumentation in court. While he was deeply and successfully engaged in his demanding legal practice, Abraham Lincoln did not entirely abandon his keen interest in the political sphere. He remained a steadfastly loyal Whig and frequently spoke at political gatherings and rallies, actively campaigning for various Whig candidates during election seasons. However, the Whig Party itself, the political home he had known for so long, was beginning to show undeniable signs of serious internal fracture. These divisions were largely, though not exclusively, over the increasingly contentious and morally charged issue of slavery. The Compromise of 1850, a complex package of legislation intended by its proponents to settle disputes over slavery in newly acquired Western territories, provided only a temporary and deeply uneasy truce. The nation was becoming visibly more polarized with each passing year, and the old, established political alignments were clearly struggling to maintain their coherence. For Abraham, this period of intense focus on his legal work also provided him with considerable and welcome opportunity for extensive reading and deep personal reflection. He faithfully continued his lifelong habit of rigorous self-education. He delved into works of history, finding lessons in the past. He read poetry, appreciating its beauty and emotional depth. He even reportedly studied Euclid's Elements of Geometry, not to become a mathematician, but to further improve his capacity for logical reasoning and precise argument. He also explored texts on political economy, seeking to understand the forces shaping society and commerce. This disciplined intellectual activity sharpened his already formidable mind and significantly broadened his understanding of complex social and political issues. It was, in essence, a time of quiet but profound internal growth, subtly preparing him in ways he could not yet fully foresee for the immense and unprecedented challenges that lay on the horizon. The relative political calm that Abraham Lincoln had been experiencing was abruptly shattered in the year 1854. This was due to the passage of the highly controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. This piece of legislation, notably championed by his fellow Illinoisan, Senator Stephen A. Douglas, effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That earlier compromise had for decades prohibited slavery in territories north of the 3630/parallel. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, in its place, introduced the principle of popular sovereignty. This doctrine allowed settlers in newly forming territories to decide for themselves, through a local vote, whether or not to permit the institution of slavery within their borders. This act was nothing short of a political earthquake. It outraged a great many people in the northern states, including Abraham Lincoln, who viewed it as a dangerous and morally reprehensible concession to Southern slaveholding interests and a profound betrayal of the nation's founding principles regarding human liberty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had the immediate effect of reigniting Abraham Lincoln's passion for politics with a newfound intensity and an unmistakable moral focus. He was, as he himself later stated with characteristic directness, aroused as he had never been before. He clearly saw the potential expansion of slavery not merely as a political issue to be debated, but as a profound moral wrong that actively threatened the very foundations of the American Republic. He began to speak out with great force and conviction against the act and its far-reaching implications. His speeches during this pivotal period were marked by a new depth of moral conviction and a powerful, clear articulation of the anti-slavery case. This case was built both on fundamental moral principles and on his careful interpretation of the intentions of the nation's founding fathers. This re-entry into the heated political arena was not a reluctant one for Lincoln, despite his earlier disappointments with his congressional term. The rapidly escalating crisis over the future of slavery in the nation provided him with a cause that resonated deeply with his most fundamental core beliefs. The preceding wilderness years, though primarily filled with diligent legal work and quiet, intensive study, had inadvertently prepared him exceptionally well for this critical moment. He had meticulously honed his considerable skills as a debater, a profound thinker, and an effective communicator. Now, with the nation clearly facing what he considered to be its gravest challenge since its inception, Abraham Lincoln was ready, willing, and eminently able to step back onto the public stage, his voice now carrying a renewed and compelling sense of urgency and a profound moral authority that was hard to ignore. Chapter 8. A House Dividing Itself. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 was not just a legislative change. It was a seismic event that sent shockwaves across the American political landscape. It dramatically reshaped existing alliances and propelled Abraham Lincoln with renewed vigor back into the forefront of the burgeoning anti-slavery movement. By permitting the potential expansion of slavery into new territories based on the principle of popular sovereignty, the act effectively swept aside the Missouri Compromise, a boundary that had, for over 3 decades, attempted to limit slavery's spread. This legislative upheaval deeply angered many Northerners. They saw it as a dangerous capitulation, opening vast Western lands to an institution they increasingly condemned as a moral stain on the nation and a direct threat to the principles of free labor. Abraham Lincoln was prominent among those who were profoundly disturbed by this turn of events. In response, he delivered a series of remarkably powerful speeches during the latter part of 1854. One of his most notable addresses was given in Peoria, Illinois. In these speeches, he meticulously and clearly articulated his strong opposition to both the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the broader principle of allowing slavery to extend its reach. His arguments were characterized by careful research, impeccable logical structure, and a delivery infused with compelling moral earnestness. He consistently argued that the Founding Fathers had envisioned a future where slavery was placed on a course of ultimate extinction. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, he contended, represented a perilous and unacceptable deviation from this original American intent. He passionately decried what he termed the new position, that slavery should be treated as a matter of mere indifference, insisting instead on recognizing its inherent and profound injustice. The intense political turmoil and public outcry generated by the Kansas-Nebraska Act soon led to the rapid disintegration of the existing Whig Party, the political organization to which Abraham Lincoln had long maintained his allegiance. The Whigs found themselves deeply and irreparably divided over the pervasive issue of slavery, rendering them unable to formulate or maintain a unified national stance. Consequently, anti-slavery Whigs, alongside disillusioned Northern Democrats and members of the smaller Free Soil Party, began to search for a new political home. They started to coalesce around a new, unifying banner. This widespread movement culminated in the formation of the Republican Party, a new political entity founded squarely on the core principle of vigorously opposing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. After some initial characteristic caution and thoughtful consideration, Abraham Lincoln aligned himself decisively with this new and dynamic party. His role in the establishment and subsequent growth of the Republican Party within the state of Illinois was undeniably significant. His well-earned reputation for unwavering integrity, his formidable intellectual prowess, and his increasingly powerful oratory made him a natural and respected leader within the emerging organization. He dedicated considerable effort to unifying the diverse and sometimes disparate factions that constituted the early Republican coalition. He consistently emphasized their shared commitment to the crucial goal of preventing slavery from spreading any further. He astutely understood that for the new party to achieve success, it needed to appeal to a broad range of voters. These were individuals who, while perhaps not all staunch abolitionists, were nevertheless deeply concerned about what they perceived as the aggressive and expansionist posture of the Southern slave power. Meanwhile, the situation in the Kansas Territory itself tragically devolved into open violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed with increasing ferocity in a bitter struggle to control the territory's future. This brutal and protracted conflict soon became known across the nation as Bleeding Kansas. These violent events further inflamed national passions and served to underscore the profound and dangerous divisions that the Propolis Sire's Kansas-Nebraska Act had tragically unleashed upon the country. For Abraham Lincoln and many other observers in the North, these events were a grim and bloody illustration of the dire consequences that arose when the nation strayed from its founding principles regarding human freedom and self-governance. The doctrine of popular sovereignty, far from being a peaceful solution, appeared in practice to lead only to further bloodshed, deeper animosity, and a fractured society. In June of 1858, a pivotal moment arrived in Lincoln's political career. He was officially nominated by the Illinois Republican Party to run for a seat in the United States Senate. His opponent was the incumbent Stephen A. Douglas, the very architect of the controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. Upon accepting this important nomination, Lincoln delivered one of the most renowned and consequential speeches of his entire career. This address was given at the State Republican Convention, which was held in Springfield. It has since become famously known as the House Divided speech, a title drawn from its most memorable and impactful lines. Its central message served as a stark and unambiguous warning about the precarious future of the Union. A house divided against itself cannot stand, Abraham Lincoln declared, powerfully quoting a passage from the Gospels to underscore his point. He continued, "I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other." This was an exceptionally bold and, for its time, somewhat radical public statement. Many observers, including some of his own supporters, initially perceived it as being too extreme, fearing it would alienate moderate voters who still hoped for compromise. However, Lincoln had become firmly convinced that the nation was on an inexorable path towards a fundamental crisis, one that could not be perpetually avoided by further political compromises or by ignoring the underlying moral questions. The House divided speech perfectly and incisively framed the central issue not only of the upcoming senatorial campaign against Douglas, but also of the larger, all-consuming national debate. It strategically positioned Lincoln as a man of profound principle, one who was unwilling to shy away from confronting the hard and uncomfortable truths that were facing the country. He was forcefully arguing that Stephen Douglas's cherished doctrine of popular sovereignty, far from offering a viable solution to the slavery issue, was actually exacerbating the dangerous division by allowing for slavery's potential and seemingly endless expansion. This powerful speech, with its unforgettable imagery and its clear, unwavering articulation of the immense stakes involved, effectively set the stage for an epic series of public confrontations with his formidable political rival, Stephen Douglas, a contest of ideas and wills that would soon capture the rapt attention of the entire nation. Chapter 9. The Great Debates. The 1858 Illinois Senate race set the stage for an extraordinary political contest, pitting Abraham Lincoln, the determined Republican challenger, against Stephen A. Douglas, the powerful Democratic incumbent. Douglas, widely known across the nation as the Little Giant, due to his short physical stature but formidable political influence and debating prowess, was a towering figure in American politics at the time. Abraham Lincoln, while highly respected within Illinois for his intellect and integrity, was considerably less known on the national stage. The ensuing campaign between these two contrasting figures centered squarely on the most divisive and morally charged issue of the era, slavery, quickly evolved into a series of landmark public confrontations that would come to be known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates, captivating the attention of the entire nation. Recognizing the immense public interest in their sharply contrasting positions and the critical importance of the issues at stake, Abraham Lincoln took the initiative and challenged Stephen Douglas to a series of face-to-face debates to be held across the state of Illinois. After some negotiation, Douglas, confident in his well-honed debating abilities, eventually agreed to 7 joint appearances. These were scheduled to take place in different towns, one in each of the state's congressional districts where they had not already both spoken during the campaign. These were not debates in the tightly structured, time-constrained format familiar to modern audiences. Instead, one candidate would typically open with an hour-long address. The other would then have a full hour and a half for a detailed reply, and the first speaker would conclude with a half-hour rebuttal. Enormous crowds, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, flocked to towns like Ottawa, Freeport, Galesburg, and Alton, eager to witness these compelling intellectual duels firsthand. The very core of their protracted arguments revolved around the contentious place of slavery within American society and, most critically, its potential for expansion into the newly forming Western territories. Stephen Douglas consistently championed his doctrine of popular sovereignty. He forcefully argued that the people residing in each territory should have the democratic right to decide for themselves, through their local legislatures, whether to permit or prohibit slavery within their borders. He presented this as the most democratic and fair solution, one that respected the principle of local self-government and avoided imposing a federal mandate on the issue. Douglas often accused Lincoln and the Republican Party of being radical abolitionists who sought to disrupt the Union and interfere with the established rights of Southern states. He also frequently appealed to racist sentiments, asserting that the American government was made by white men for white men. Abraham Lincoln, in stark contrast, took a firm moral stand against the extension of slavery. While he did not at this point advocate for the immediate abolition of slavery in the states where it already existed, acknowledging the constitutional protections in place, he vehemently opposed its spread into any new territories. He argued that slavery was a moral, social, and political wrong. He contended that the Founding Fathers had viewed slavery as an evil and had intended to place it on a course of ultimate extinction. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Douglas's popular sovereignty, he argued, represented a dangerous retreat from this original vision, effectively legitimizing slavery and opening the door for its indefinite perpetuation and expansion. Lincoln masterfully used historical arguments and appeals to the Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal to underscore his position, though he often had to navigate the complex racial prejudices of the era in his public statements. One particularly famous exchange occurred during the debate in Freeport. Lincoln strategically pressed Douglas on how he could reconcile his principle of popular sovereignty with the Supreme Court's recent Dred Scott decision of 1857. That controversial ruling had declared that Congress had no power to exclude slavery from the territories, and that African Americans were not citizens. Douglas's response, which became known as the Freeport Doctrine, was an attempt to salvage popular sovereignty. He stated that, regardless of the Supreme Court's ruling, the people of a territory could effectively exclude slavery by withholding the local police regulations and supportive legislation necessary for it to exist. A territory could, in essence, have unfriendly legislation. While this answer may have helped Douglas in his Illinois re-election bid by appealing to those who wanted to keep slavery out of their specific territory, it deeply alienated Southern Democrats who saw it as a betrayal of their rights as affirmed by the Dred Scott decision. This further fractured the National Democratic Party. Throughout the 7 debates, both men demonstrated remarkable rhetorical skill, endurance, and intellectual agility. Douglas was often aggressive, using his powerful voice and confident demeanor to dominate the stage. Lincoln, taller and initially appearing somewhat more awkward, countered with his characteristic blend of logical precision, folksy humor, pointed questions, and profound moral conviction. The extensive newspaper coverage of these debates, often reprinting the speeches in their entirety, allowed people across the country to follow the arguments closely. This significantly raised Abraham Lincoln's national profile, showcasing him as a thoughtful and articulate spokesman for the growing anti-slavery movement in the North. In the end, when the Illinois state legislature voted for the U.S. senator, as was the practice before the direct election of senators, Stephen A. Douglas won re-election. The legislative districts were drawn in such a way that favored the Democrats, despite Republicans possibly winning a slight majority of the popular vote in the legislative races. So, Abraham Lincoln lost the Senate seat. However, in a larger sense, he achieved a significant victory. The debates had catapulted him from a regional politician to a figure of national prominence. His clear and principled stand against the expansion of slavery and his skillful articulation of the Republican position had impressed many influential leaders and ordinary citizens alike. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 were a defining moment in American political history. They laid bare the deep and seemingly irreconcilable differences over slavery that were pushing the nation ever closer to the brink of disunion. Although he did not win the election, Abraham Lincoln emerged from this crucible of debate with his reputation greatly enhanced, his principles clearly defined, and his position as a leading voice against the extension of slavery firmly and irrevocably solidified on the national stage. The giant killer, though not victorious in this round, had made his mark. Chapter 10. A Nation Listens at Cooper Union. Following the intense senatorial campaign and the celebrated debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858, Abraham Lincoln found his national reputation significantly enhanced. Though he had lost the Senate election, his articulate defense of the Republican position against slavery's expansion had resonated far beyond the borders of Illinois. In late 1859, he received an invitation to speak in New York City at Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, a prominent pulpit known for its anti-slavery stance. The venue was later changed to the Cooper Union in Manhattan, a newer and larger hall, for an address scheduled in February 1860. This invitation presented Lincoln with a crucial opportunity to address a sophisticated Eastern audience and further establish his credentials as a serious national statesman. Abraham Lincoln understood the immense importance of this engagement. New York was a center of media, finance, and political influence. A strong performance at Cooper Union could significantly bolster his standing within the Republican Party and present him as a viable, thoughtful leader as the country looked towards the upcoming presidential election of 1860. He therefore prepared for this speech with extraordinary care and meticulous research. He spent weeks, even months, delving into the historical record, particularly focusing on the views and actions of the 39 men who had signed the original United States Constitution regarding federal control over slavery in the territories. On the evening of February 27th, 1860, Abraham Lincoln stepped onto the stage at Cooper Union before a large and influential audience. It included many of New York's leading political figures, editors, intellectuals, and prominent citizens. many of whom were curious to see and hear this somewhat rustic lawyer from the West who had so effectively challenged Stephen Douglas. The initial impression Lincoln made was, perhaps, not overwhelming. He was tall and somewhat awkwardly dressed, and his Western accent was noticeable. However, any reservations the audience might have harbored quickly dissipated once he began to speak. His address was not an example of soaring, emotional oratory in the style of some contemporary speakers. Instead, it was a masterpiece of logical argumentation, historical analysis, and clear, forceful reasoning. The first and longest part of the speech was dedicated to systematically refuting the Southern contention, often voiced by Stephen Douglas, that the Founding Fathers understood the Constitution to forbid the federal government from regulating slavery in the territories. Lincoln, drawing upon his exhaustive research, demonstrated point by point that a clear majority of the signers of the Constitution had, through their votes and actions in Congress and other capacities, supported federal control over slavery in territories. He meticulously showed that they had repeatedly voted for measures to restrict or prohibit slavery in federal territories. This careful, almost lawyerly presentation of historical evidence had a powerful impact on the audience. It directly countered the narrative being promoted by pro-slavery advocates and by figures like Douglas, who sought a middle ground through popular sovereignty. Lincoln effectively argued that the Republican position of restricting slavery's expansion was not radical or new, but was, in fact, consistent with the original understanding and intent of the nation's founders. He was, in essence, claiming the mantle of true conservatism for the Republican cause, aligning it with the nation's foundational principles rather than with disruptive innovation. In the second part of his speech, Lincoln turned his attention to the Southern people, addressing them directly but firmly. He acknowledged their grievances, but firmly refuted their accusations that Republicans were a sectional party inciting insurrection. He calmly and rationally appealed to them to consider the facts and to abandon their threats of secession if a Republican were elected president. He made it clear that Republicans had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, as they recognized the constitutional protections, but they would stand firm against its expansion. Finally, in the third section, Lincoln spoke to his fellow Republicans. He urged them to stand by their principles with courage and conviction, despite the threats and accusations from the South. He famously admonished them, "Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it." This concluding call to steadfastness, grounded in moral conviction, resonated deeply with his audience. It was a message of firm resolve, not of angry denunciation, delivered with a quiet but powerful sense of authority. The Cooper Union address was a resounding success. It was widely reported in newspapers across the North, often printed in its entirety, and it significantly elevated Lincoln's stature. The sophisticated New York audience, many of whom might have initially been skeptical, were profoundly impressed by his intellectual command, his thoroughness, and the moral force of his argument. He had demonstrated that he was not merely a homespun prairie debater, but a statesman of considerable depth and substance. The speech helped to dispel any lingering notions that he was a one-issue candidate or simply a folksy Westerner. It established him as a thoughtful, principled, and electable leader, perfectly positioning him for the Republican presidential nomination just a few months later. The nation, or at least a very significant part of it, had indeed listened. Chapter 11. The Unlikely President-Elect. The year 1860 was a momentous one for Abraham Lincoln and for the United States. Following his compelling performance at Cooper Union and his continued articulate stance against slavery's expansion, his star within the Republican Party had risen considerably. When the Republicans gathered in Chicago for their national convention in May, Lincoln, initially considered an underdog by some, emerged as the presidential nominee after several ballots. His reputation as Honest Abe, his compelling life story, and his moderate yet firm anti-slavery position made him an attractive candidate in a deeply fractured nation. The upcoming election, however, would be anything but straightforward. The Democratic Party, which had dominated national politics for years, splintered over the issue of slavery. Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who insisted on federal protection for slavery in the territories. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Blank. Douglas, Lincoln's old rival, who continued to advocate for popular sovereignty. A fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell of Tennessee, hoping to find a middle ground by simply ignoring the slavery issue and focusing on preserving the Union and upholding the Constitution. This four-way race created a volatile and unpredictable political landscape. Abraham Lincoln, following the custom of the time for presidential candidates, did not actively campaign himself. Instead, his supporters, particularly the wide-awakes, enthusiastic young Republicans who organized parades and rallies, campaigned vigorously on his behalf. The Republican platform opposed the extension of slavery into the territories, but also included planks supporting a protective tariff, a Homestead Act to encourage Western settlement, and federal aid for a transcontinental railroad. These positions appealed to a broad range of Northern and Western voters. Lincoln remained in Springfield, receiving visitors and corresponding with party leaders, quietly confident but keenly aware of the immense stakes. When the election results came in on November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln had won the presidency. However, his victory was a peculiar one. He secured a clear majority of the Electoral College votes, 180 to be exact, which was more than enough to win. But he did so by carrying almost all of the northern states, while failing to win a single southern state. In fact, in 10 southern states, his name had not even appeared on the ballot. He received only about 40% of the popular vote nationwide, meaning nearly 60% of those who voted had chosen someone else. This fractured victory underscored the profound sectional divide that was tearing the country apart. The reaction in the southern states to Lincoln's election was swift and alarming. Many Southerners viewed the Republican Party as fundamentally hostile to their way of life and to the institution of slavery, upon which their economy and social structure were built. They saw Lincoln's victory, despite his assurances that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, as a dire threat. To them, a black Republican president signaled the beginning of the end for their cherished institutions and their political power within the Union. The rhetoric of secession, which had been simmering for years, now boiled over. Before Abraham Lincoln even had a chance to take the oath of office, the Union began to unravel. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina officially seceded from the United States. Over the next few weeks, 6 other Deep South states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed suit. These states argued that the Union was a voluntary compact, and that they had the right to leave it when they believed their rights were no longer being protected. They began to seize federal forts, arsenals, and custom houses within their borders. The period between Lincoln's election in November and his inauguration in March 1861 was one of immense pressure and agonizing uncertainty. The outgoing president, James Buchanan, proved largely ineffective in stemming the tide of secession. He believed secession was illegal, but also believed the federal government had no constitutional power to coerce a state to remain in the Union. Meanwhile, President-elect Lincoln was in a difficult position. He could not yet exercise any official power. Yet he was under immense pressure to make public statements or offer compromises that might halt the crisis. Abraham Lincoln largely maintained a public silence during these critical months, believing that any statement he made would likely be distorted by his opponents and could further inflame the situation. He privately made it clear, however, that he would uphold the Constitution and that he considered secession to be illegal. He rejected proposals for compromises that would involve abandoning the core Republican principle of preventing slavery's expansion into the territories. As he prepared to journey from Springfield to Washington for his inauguration, he faced the daunting prospect of leading a nation that was quite literally and tragically coming apart at the seams. The unlikely president-elect was about to inherit a monumental crisis. Chapter 12. A Union Torn Asunder. The journey Abraham Lincoln undertook from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C. in February 1861 for his inauguration was unlike any previous presidential transition. It was a passage through a nation teetering on the very brink of self-destruction. As his train made its way eastward, stopping in various cities for speeches and appearances, the air was thick with tension and uncertainty. 7 states had already declared their secession from the Union, and the threat of further departures loomed large. There were even credible reports of assassination plots against the president-elect, forcing him to alter his travel plans and pass through Baltimore at night under heavy guard. During this fraught period, efforts at compromise continued in Washington, most notably the Crittenden Compromise, which proposed several constitutional amendments to protect slavery in the states where it existed and to extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific. However, Lincoln, while willing to reassure the South of his lack of intention to interfere with slavery where it was already established, stood firm against any compromise that would allow for the expansion of slavery into new territories. This was the core principle upon which he and the Republican Party had been elected, and he believed abandoning it would betray their mandate and ultimately fail to resolve the underlying crisis. On March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood before a large crowd gathered at the east portico of the unfinished Capitol building to deliver his first inaugural address. His words were carefully chosen, intended to strike a balance between firmness and conciliation. He began by reassuring the southern states that he had no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it existed. He stated, "I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." He also pledged to uphold the Constitution, including its provisions regarding the return of fugitive slaves. However, Lincoln then unequivocally asserted the perpetuity of the Union. He argued that, legally, the Union was unbroken, and that acts of secession were legally void. He declared his solemn oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and the government of the United States. He stated his intention to hold, occupy, and possess federal property and to collect duties and imposts, but he also indicated that there would be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere unless it became necessary for these objects. He essentially placed the onus for any potential conflict squarely on the seceding states. Perhaps the most memorable and moving part of his address was its concluding appeal to the Southern people. He pleaded with them to pause and reflect before taking any irrevocable steps. "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war," he stated. "The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors." He closed with an eloquent call for national reconciliation. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." Despite Lincoln's eloquent plea, the forces driving disunion were too powerful. Even as he spoke, the newly formed Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as its president, was solidifying its own government. One of the most immediate crises facing the new president was the status of Fort Sumter, a federal installation in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The fort was running low on supplies, and its Union garrison was surrounded by hostile Confederate forces. To resupply the fort would be seen by the Confederacy as an act of aggression. To abandon it would be a tacit recognition of Confederate sovereignty. After much deliberation, and against the advice of some of his cabinet members, Lincoln decided to send an unarmed naval expedition to resupply Fort Sumter with provisions only. He notified the governor of South Carolina of his peaceful intentions. However, the Confederate government, viewing any attempt to hold the fort as a challenge to its authority, decided to act. On April 12, 1861, before the resupply mission could arrive, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. After a bombardment lasting more than 30 hours, the Union garrison, outgunned and overwhelmed, surrendered the fort. The attack on Fort Sumter was the spark that ignited the Civil War. It ended months of agonizing uncertainty and forced both sides to commit to a path of armed conflict. In response to the firing on the fort, President Lincoln issued a proclamation on April 15th. calling forth 75,000 state militiamen to suppress the rebellion. This call for troops, in turn, prompted 4 more southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to secede and join the Confederacy. The Union, which Abraham Lincoln had so desperately tried to preserve through peace and reason, was now irrevocably torn asunder. The immense weight of leading a divided nation through a catastrophic civil war now rested squarely upon his shoulders. Chapter 13. The Generals Who Wouldn't Fight. With the fall of Fort Sumter and the subsequent call for troops, the American Civil War began in earnest. The initial wave of patriotic fervor on both sides brought thousands of eager volunteers into the newly forming armies. However, President Abraham Lincoln quickly discovered that enthusiasm alone would not win the war. He faced the daunting task of mobilizing the Union's resources, defining its war aims beyond simply preserving the Union, and, most pressingly, finding military commanders who possessed the skill, determination, and aggressive spirit needed to defeat the Confederacy. This search for effective leadership would prove to be one of his most persistent and frustrating challenges during the early years of the conflict. The first major battle of the war, fought at Bull Run, or Manassas, as the Confederates called it, in July 1861, ended in a shocking and sobering defeat for the Union Army. The raw, poorly trained Union troops, initially confident of a quick victory, were routed by Confederate forces, sending them fleeing back towards Washington, D.C. in disarray. This disastrous outcome dispelled any lingering illusions that the war would be short or easy. It also underscored the urgent need for better training, organization, and, crucially, more competent generalship for the Union forces. Following Bull Run, Lincoln appointed General George B. McClellan to command the main Union force in the East, which became known as the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was a brilliant organizer and administrator. He excelled at training troops, building fortifications, and instilling a sense of discipline and professionalism in the army. He was immensely popular with his soldiers, who affectionately called him Little Mac. However, McClellan also possessed a cautious, almost hesitant temperament when it came to committing his well-drilled army to battle. He consistently overestimated the strength of the enemy and seemed reluctant to risk his beloved troops in aggressive, offensive operations. President Lincoln, who, as Commander-in-Chief, bore the ultimate responsibility for the war effort, grew increasingly frustrated with McClellan's inaction. Lincoln, despite his own lack of formal military training, possessed a keen, strategic mind. He diligently studied books on military strategy and tactics, trying to understand the principles of warfare. He urged McClellan to advance, to strike the enemy, to make use of the Union's superior numbers and resources. Yet, McClellan repeatedly delayed, always demanding more men, more supplies, more time for preparation. His relationship with Lincoln became strained, marked by the general's often disrespectful attitude towards the president and Lincoln's growing exasperation. In the spring of 1862, McClellan finally launched his Peninsula Campaign, an ambitious amphibious operation aimed at capturing the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, by advancing up the Virginia Peninsula. However, the campaign, despite some initial successes, bogged down due to McClellan's characteristic caution and a series of skillful countermaneuvers by Confederate General Robert E. Lee. After months of fighting and heavy casualties, the campaign ultimately failed, and the Army of the Potomac was forced to withdraw. This was a bitter disappointment for Lincoln and the Union. The search for capable commanders extended to other theaters of the war as well. In the West, Union forces achieved some important early successes, notably under a then little-known general named Ulysses S. Grant, who captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. Grant displayed a tenacity and a willingness to fight that contrasted sharply with McClellan's approach. However, even Grant's path was not without setbacks and controversy. Lincoln often had to defend his generals against political criticism and public outcry, especially when battles resulted in high casualties, as was the case at Shiloh. Throughout these trying early years, Lincoln endured immense pressure. The war was not going well for the Union in the crucial Eastern Theater. Casualties were mounting, and public morale in the North sometimes wavered. There were calls for peace through compromise, and Lincoln faced criticism from all sides, from radical Republicans who wanted a more aggressive war effort and the immediate abolition of slavery, and from conservative Democrats who opposed the war's aims and Lincoln's leadership. He patiently listened to advice, managed his often contentious cabinet, and grappled with the immense strategic and political complexities of the conflict. Lincoln's relationship with his generals was often a source of deep anxiety. He famously lamented that sending reinforcements to McClellan was like shoveling fleas across a barnyard. He cycled through several commanders in the East after McClellan's failures, including John Pope, who suffered a resounding defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and Ambrose Burnside, who led the army to a catastrophic loss at Fredericksburg. Finding a general who not only understood strategy but also possessed the moral courage to fight and to take calculated risks proved to be an elusive quest. This struggle for effective military leadership was a defining feature of the early part of the war, profoundly testing Abraham Lincoln's resolve, his patience, and his ability to learn and adapt as a wartime commander-in-chief. Chapter 14. A Proclamation of Freedom. As the Civil War dragged on through its bloody second year, President Abraham Lincoln faced mounting pressures and a deepening personal conviction that the conflict needed to embrace a higher moral purpose beyond simply restoring the Union as it had been. The issue of slavery, the fundamental cause of the war, loomed large. While he had initially been cautious about alienating the slave-holding border states that remained loyal to the Union, the sacrifices of the war and the intransigence of the Confederacy pushed Lincoln towards a more radical course of action regarding emancipation. This shift would fundamentally redefine the nature and aims of the conflict. From the outset of the war, abolitionists and radical Republicans had urged Lincoln to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. They argued that freeing the slaves would strike a powerful blow against the Confederacy's ability to wage war, as enslaved labor underpinned its economy and war effort. They also believed it was a moral imperative, aligning the Union cause with the principle of human freedom. Lincoln, however, had to weigh these arguments against several complex considerations. He was concerned about the constitutionality of such an act, the reaction of the border states, and the potential impact on Northern public opinion, which was not uniformly anti-slavery. Throughout the first half of 1862, Lincoln privately wrestled with the idea of emancipation as a war measure. He explored various options, including schemes for gradual, compensated emancipation. However, as the war continued with its immense human cost and Confederate victories, particularly in the East, the strategic and moral arguments for a bolder move gained strength in his mind. He came to believe that emancipation was not only morally right, but also a military necessity, a way to weaken the Confederacy and strengthen the Union, both domestically and in the eyes of foreign powers like Britain and France, which were officially neutral, but whose potential recognition of the Confederacy was a constant concern. In July 1862, Lincoln informed his cabinet that he had decided to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. He presented a draft to them, but Secretary of State William Seward advised him to wait for a Union military victory before making such a momentous announcement. Seward reasoned that issuing it after a string of defeats might make it appear as an act of desperation, a last shriek on the retreat. Lincoln, ever the pragmatist, saw the wisdom in this counsel and decided to bide his time, waiting for a more opportune moment on the battlefield. That moment came in September 1862, following the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. While the battle was tactically inconclusive, it forced General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army to retreat from its invasion of the North. Though not the decisive victory Lincoln might have hoped for, it was enough of a success to provide the platform he needed. On September 22, 1862, just 5 days after the battle, President Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This document declared that as of January 1st, 1863, all enslaved persons in any state or part of a state still in rebellion against the United States shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The preliminary proclamation gave the Confederate States 100 days to cease their rebellion and return to the Union if they wished to avoid the Edict of Emancipation. None of them did. Consequently, on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. This historic document declared free all slaves in the rebellious territories. It is important to note its limitations. It did not apply to enslaved people in the loyal border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, nor to those in Confederate areas already under Union control. Lincoln justified these exclusions based on his war powers. He argued he could only emancipate slaves in territories currently in rebellion as a military necessity. The immediate, practical impact of the Emancipation Proclamation was, in some ways, limited. It directly freed very few slaves on the day it was issued, as it applied only to areas where the Union government had no effective control. However, its symbolic and long-term significance was immense. It fundamentally transformed the character of the war. The struggle was no longer solely about preserving the old Union. It was now also, explicitly, a war to end slavery and to achieve human liberty. This gave the Union cause a powerful moral authority, both at home and abroad, making it far more difficult for European powers to consider recognizing or supporting the Confederacy. Furthermore, the Emancipation Proclamation officially authorized the recruitment of African American men into the Union Army and Navy. Thousands of formerly enslaved men and free blacks rushed to enlist, eager to fight for their own freedom and the liberation of their people. These soldiers, who eventually numbered nearly 200,000, served with great courage and distinction, making a vital contribution to the Union war effort. Their participation was a powerful testament to the proclamation's impact and the changing nature of the struggle. While it was not the end of slavery that would require a constitutional amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation was a monumental step, a promise of freedom that forever altered the course of American history. Guided by Abraham Lincoln's evolving understanding and unwavering moral courage. Chapter 15: Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The summer of 1863 proved to be a pivotal period in the American Civil War, marked by two crucial Union victories that significantly shifted the strategic balance and offered a glimmer of hope to a war-weary North. These triumphs occurred nearly simultaneously in early July, at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in the east, and at Vicksburg, Mississippi, in the west. For President Abraham Lincoln, who had endured so many months of military frustration and setbacks, these successes provided a much-needed validation of his leadership and the Union's perseverance. In the Eastern Theater, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, emboldened by his earlier victory at Chancellorsville, launched his second invasion of the North. He hoped to win a decisive battle on Union soil, which might demoralize the Northern public, encourage foreign recognition of the Confederacy, and perhaps even lead to a negotiated peace. His Army of Northern Virginia crossed into Pennsylvania, where it encountered the Union Army of the Potomac, now under the command of General George Meade, near the small town of Gettysburg. The ensuing battle, fought over 3 brutal days from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on the North American continent. The fighting at Gettysburg was ferocious, with both sides displaying immense courage and suffering staggering casualties. Key moments included the fierce struggles for strategic locations like Little Round Top, Culp's Hill, and the Peach Orchard. The climax of the battle occurred on the 3rd day with Pickett's Charge, a massive Confederate infantry assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The charge, though incredibly brave, was repulsed with devastating losses for the Confederates. Unable to achieve his objectives, and having suffered irreplaceable casualties, General Lee was forced to retreat back into Virginia. The Union had won a critical defensive victory, effectively ending Lee's offensive capabilities on such a grand scale for the remainder of the war. Almost concurrently with the victory at Gettysburg, the Union achieved another monumental success far to the west. General Ulysses S. Grant, after a brilliant and audacious campaign of maneuver and siege, captured the strategic Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was situated on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River and was considered the key to controlling the entire river. Its capture had been a major Union objective since the start of the war. Grant's army had surrounded the city, subjecting it to a prolonged siege that lasted for more than 40 days. Finally, on July 4th, 1863, the day after Lee's retreat from Gettysburg began, the starving Confederate garrison at Vicksburg surrendered to Grant. The fall of Vicksburg, coupled with earlier Union successes along the river, meant that the entire Mississippi River was now under Union control. This effectively split the Confederacy in two, cutting off Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the rest of the rebellious states. It also opened up the river as a vital artery for Union commerce and military transport. For President Lincoln, Grant's victory at Vicksburg was particularly gratifying. He had long recognized the strategic importance of the Mississippi and had placed great faith in Grant's tenacity and military skill, even when Grant had faced criticism. These twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, occurring within days of each other, marked a clear turning point in the war. While the war was far from over, and many more bloody battles lay ahead, the tide had demonstrably shifted in the Union's favor. The Confederacy's offensive power in the East was significantly diminished, and its territory was now geographically divided. Northern morale, which had been sagging, received a significant boost. For Abraham Lincoln, these victories were a profound relief, but also a moment for solemn reflection on the immense sacrifices made. A few months later, in November 1863, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to participate in the dedication of a national cemetery for the Union soldiers who had died there. It was on this occasion that he delivered his brief but extraordinarily powerful Gettysburg Address. In just 272 words, he eloquently redefined the purpose of the war and the meaning of American nationhood. He spoke of the nation being conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He honored the soldiers who had fought and died, stating that their sacrifice had consecrated the ground far beyond any words. Lincoln then connected their sacrifice to the enduring task of the living, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address, delivered in the wake of a crucial military victory, transcended the immediate context of the war. It became a timeless expression of America's highest ideals and a profound meditation on the enduring meaning of self-government and human equality, forever linking the battlefield sacrifices to the very survival and purpose of the nation. Chapter 16. The Price of Re-Election. As the year 1864 dawned, the Civil War, despite significant Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, raged on with no definitive end in sight. The human cost was staggering, and a weary Northern public increasingly longed for peace. Against this somber backdrop, President Abraham Lincoln faced the daunting prospect of a presidential election. Seeking a second term in the midst of such a brutal and seemingly interminable conflict was an immense challenge, one that would test his political acumen and personal resilience to their very limits. The price of leadership during wartime was indeed proving to be exceptionally high. The political landscape in the North was deeply fractured. The Democratic Party, sensing an opportunity, nominated former General George B. McClellan to run against Lincoln. McClellan, still popular with many soldiers, despite his earlier command failures, campaigned on a platform that essentially declared the war a failure and called for a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. This peace platform, while appealing to those exhausted by the conflict, was seen by many Republicans as a capitulation that would render all the sacrifices made in vain and effectively recognize Confederate independence, thereby dissolving the Union. Even within his own Republican Party, Lincoln faced considerable opposition. Radical Republicans, frustrated by what they perceived as his overly cautious approach to Reconstruction and his initial slowness on emancipation, briefly considered alternative candidates. Some felt he was not prosecuting the war vigorously enough or was too lenient in his proposed terms for restoring the Southern states to the Union. Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, an ambitious member of Lincoln's own cabinet, made maneuvers to secure the nomination for himself, though these efforts ultimately failed to gain significant traction. For a time, Lincoln's chances of even being renominated, let alone re-elected, seemed uncertain. The summer of 1864 was a particularly bleak period for Lincoln and the Union cause. General Ulysses S. Grant, now in command of all Union armies, was engaged in a relentless but bloody campaign against General Robert E. Lee's forces in Virginia. Battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor produced horrific casualties for the Union, leading some in the North to label Grant a butcher. The seemingly endless slaughter, with no clear, decisive victory in the East, deeply eroded public morale. Many people began to despair that the war could ever be won, or that if it could, the cost would be too devastating to bear. Abraham Lincoln himself became deeply pessimistic about his prospects for re-election during this period. He confided in friends and colleagues that he expected to lose. In late August, he even went so far as to write a private memorandum which he had his cabinet members sign without reading. In it, he pledged that if he lost the election, he would cooperate fully with the president-elect to save the Union before the inauguration, as he believed the new president would likely be operating on a platform that might lead to the Union's dissolution if the war was not won quickly. This document revealed the depth of his concern for the nation's survival, even above his own political fate. However, just as the political situation seemed darkest for Lincoln, events on the battlefield began to shift the tide. On September 2nd, 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman captured the strategically important city of Atlanta, Georgia. This victory was a major blow to the Confederacy and provided a much-needed boost to Northern morale. Sherman's success signaled that the Union's strategy of total war was yielding results, and that the Confederacy's ability to resist was perhaps finally waning. Additionally, Admiral David Farragut won a significant naval victory at Mobile Bay, Alabama, further tightening the Union blockade. These military successes dramatically altered the political calculus. They reinvigorated support for Lincoln and the Republican Party, now running under the banner of the National Union Party to attract war Democrats. The argument that the war was a failure became much harder to sustain. Lincoln's steadfast leadership, once seen by some as a liability, now appeared as a source of strength and unwavering resolve. The Democratic platform, with its call for a negotiated peace, increasingly seemed like an admission of defeat just when victory appeared to be within grasp. General McClellan himself tried to distance himself from the more extreme peace elements within his party, but the damage was done. When the election was held in November 1864, Abraham Lincoln won a resounding victory. He carried all but 3 states, New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky, and secured a decisive 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. He also won a comfortable majority of the popular vote, a significant improvement over his 1860 performance. Perhaps most tellingly, he received overwhelming support from the Union soldiers who were able to cast their ballots from the field. Their votes were a powerful endorsement of his leadership and their desire to see the war through to a successful conclusion. Lincoln's re-election was a clear mandate to continue the fight to preserve the Union and, implicitly, to end slavery. The nation, though still deeply scarred and mourning its losses, had chosen to stay the course with the President who had guided it through its darkest hours. Chapter 17. With Malice Toward None. By the time Abraham Lincoln prepared to deliver his second inaugural address on March 4th, 1865, the Civil War was clearly drawing to its agonizing close. Union armies under General Grant were tightening their grip on General Lee's forces in Virginia, and General Sherman's troops had carved a destructive path through Georgia and the Carolinas. The Confederacy was crumbling, its capacity to wage war all but exhausted. Washington, D.C., on that inauguration day, was a city filled with a mixture of weary relief, anticipation of victory, and a profound sense of the immense sacrifices that had been made. The mood was markedly different from the fearful uncertainty that had shrouded his first inauguration 4 years earlier. The weather on that March day was initially rainy and bleak, mirroring the somber years of conflict. However, as Lincoln rose to speak from the east portico of the Capitol, the sun reportedly broke through the clouds, a moment that some observers chose to see as a hopeful omen. The crowd before him was large and diverse, including many African American citizens, some of whom were soldiers in the Union Army, a testament to the profound changes the war had wrought. Unlike many inaugural addresses, Lincoln's second was remarkably short, consisting of just over 700 words. Yet, it remains one of the most profound and eloquent speeches in American history. He began by acknowledging that there was less occasion for an extended address than there had been at his first inauguration. The progress of Union arms, he noted, was reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. He stated that he would not dwell on predictions for the future, as the situation was still fraught with uncertainty, though hope was high. Instead of a triumphal speech celebrating impending victory or denouncing the enemy, Lincoln offered something far more reflective and deeply philosophical. He sought to find meaning in the terrible ordeal the nation had endured, and to set a tone for the immense task of reconciliation that lay ahead. A significant portion of the address was devoted to exploring the causes and divine interpretations of the war, particularly focusing on the issue of slavery. Lincoln noted the bitter irony that both North and South read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. He then confronted the profound moral paradox of slavery. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. This was not a statement of moral relativism, but rather a call for humility and a recognition of shared human fallibility. He then offered a powerful theological interpretation of the war's immense suffering. He suggested that slavery was an offense that God perhaps now willed to remove, and that the terrible war itself might be a divine retribution visited upon both North and South for their complicity in the institution of slavery. "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray," he said, "that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." This was a stark and sobering assessment, acknowledging a shared national sin and the potential for divine justice. Having explored the war's deeper meanings, Lincoln then turned towards the future, outlining the spirit in which the nation should approach the task of rebuilding and reconciliation. It is in these concluding words that the speech reaches its emotional and moral zenith. He did not speak of punishment for the defeated South, or of glory for the victorious North. Instead, he called for a spirit of profound magnanimity and compassion. "With malice toward none," he declared, "with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." These words, delivered with a quiet solemnity, offered a vision of a reunited nation moving forward, not with vengeance, but with forgiveness and a shared commitment to healing. Lincoln's second inaugural address was not met with universal acclaim at the time. Some in the North found it too forgiving, too lacking in triumphalism. Some in the South, had they been inclined to listen, might have found its theological judgments harsh. Yet, over time it has come to be recognized as a masterpiece of political and moral literature. It reflected Lincoln's own deep spiritual struggles, his profound empathy, and his unwavering commitment to a just and merciful peace. It stands as a timeless testament to his character and his vision for a restored union, a vision that sought not to crush the defeated, but to heal a fractured nation. Chapter 18. The Final, Terrible, Swift Sword. In the early spring of 1865, following Abraham Lincoln's poignant second inaugural address, the Civil War moved inexorably towards its conclusion. The terrible, swift sword of Union military power, as Julia Ward Howe had written in The Battle Hymn of the Republic, was now striking its final, decisive blows against a weakened and exhausted Confederacy. General Ulysses S. Grant, with relentless determination, continued to press his siege of Petersburg, Virginia, a critical supply hub for the Confederate capital of Richmond and General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The strategic situation for the Confederacy was becoming increasingly dire. General William T. Sherman's Union forces, having completed their destructive march through Georgia, had turned north and were now advancing through the Carolinas, further crippling the Confederacy's ability to sustain the war effort. Lee's army, trapped in the defenses around Petersburg and Richmond, was dwindling in numbers due to casualties, desertions, and a severe lack of supplies. The Confederate soldiers were hungry, poorly clothed, and increasingly demoralized, though many still fought with a desperate courage born of loyalty to their cause and their esteemed commander. On April 2nd, 1865, Grant's forces finally broke through Lee's thin defensive lines at Petersburg. This decisive breakthrough forced Lee to order the immediate evacuation of both Petersburg and Richmond. The Confederate government, including President Jefferson Davis, hastily fled the capital, which had stood as a symbol of Southern defiance for 4 long years. The following day, April 3rd, Union troops, including regiments of African American soldiers, marched into Richmond and raised the United States flag over the former Confederate Capitol building. The fall of Richmond was a momentous event, signaling the imminent collapse of the Confederacy. President Lincoln himself, who had been at Grant's headquarters at City Point, near Petersburg, visited the fallen Confederate capital on April 4th. His arrival was low-key, without a large military escort. As he walked through the streets, he was greeted by scenes of devastation from recent fires, but also by large crowds of newly freed African Americans who thronged around him, cheering and expressing their gratitude in emotional displays. For them, Lincoln was a liberator, the embodiment of their long-awaited freedom. It was a powerful and deeply moving moment, underscoring the profound human consequences of the Union victory. Meanwhile, General Lee led his depleted and starving army of Northern Virginia westward from Richmond, hoping to escape Grant's pursuit and possibly link up with other Confederate forces in North Carolina. However, Grant's larger and better supplied Union army relentlessly pursued, cutting off Lee's avenues of retreat. The Confederate forces were exhausted, their situation hopeless. Lee recognized that further resistance would only lead to more needless bloodshed and suffering for his men. On April 9th, 1865, Palm Sunday, General Robert E. Lee met with General Ulysses S. Grant at a small private home in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. There, in a poignant and dignified encounter, Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to Grant. The terms of surrender offered by Grant were remarkably generous, reflecting President Lincoln's desire for a magnanimous peace and a swift reconciliation. Confederate soldiers were allowed to keep their sidearms and personal horses, and they were paroled and allowed to return to their homes, provided they pledged not to take up arms against the United States again. Grant also ordered that rations be provided to Lee's starving army. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, while not technically the end of all Confederate resistance, other smaller Confederate forces would surrender in the following weeks, was widely recognized as the effective end of the Civil War. News of Lee's surrender spread rapidly, setting off joyous celebrations across the North. Washington, D.C. erupted in a cacophony of cheers, cannon fire, and illuminated buildings. The 4 long, brutal years of conflict, which had claimed more than 600,000 American lives and torn the nation apart, were finally over. In the midst of this elation, Abraham Lincoln remained focused on the immense task of national healing and reconstruction. He had long been developing his plans for restoring the Southern states to the Union, advocating for a lenient approach that would encourage swift reconciliation rather than prolonged punishment. On April 11th, just 2 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln delivered his last public address from a window of the White House. In this speech, he discussed his ideas for Reconstruction, particularly focusing on the state of Louisiana. He indicated his support for allowing some African American men, particularly veterans and the very intelligent, to vote. This was a tentative but significant step towards black suffrage. His primary goal, however, was to bring the nation back together, to bind up the nation's wounds, as he had so eloquently stated in his recent inaugural address. The terrible swift sword had done its work. Now, the work of peace and reunion had to begin. Chapter 19. A nation mourns, a star extinguished. The days following General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse were filled with a profound sense of relief and jubilation across the northern states. The Civil War, after 4 long and agonizing years of bloodshed and sacrifice, was effectively over. Washington, D.C. was particularly alive with celebrations. President Abraham Lincoln, who had carried the immense burden of leadership through the nation's darkest trial, could finally look towards a future of peace and reunification. He spoke of reconciliation and began to focus more intently on the complex task of reconstructing the shattered South. Tragically, he would not live to see these plans through. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, Good Friday, Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, sought a few hours of relaxation and entertainment. They decided to attend a performance of the popular comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington. General Ulysses S. Fruebling.org. Grant and his wife had initially been invited to join them, but they had declined, opting to travel out of the city. The presidential party, which also included a young officer named Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, arrived at the theater and settled into the presidential box, which was decorated with flags. During the third act of the play, at a moment when a particularly funny line often elicited loud laughter from the audience, a man silently entered the presidential box from the rear. This man was John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and a fervent Confederate sympathizer. Booth, driven by a fanatical hatred for Lincoln and a desperate desire to avenge the defeated South, had been part of a larger conspiracy to assassinate several high-ranking Union officials that very night. He knew the layout of Ford's Theater well and had carefully planned his actions. Stealthily approaching the president from behind, John Wilkes Booth aimed a .44 caliber Derringer pistol at the back of Abraham Lincoln's head and fired a single shot at close range. Major Rathbone, realizing what had happened, lunged at Booth, but the assassin slashed him severely on the arm with a large knife. Booth then dramatically leaped from the presidential box onto the stage below, reportedly shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis!" Thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia, and possibly the South is avenged. Though he broke his leg in the fall, Booth managed to escape through a back exit of the theater, where a horse was waiting. Chaos erupted inside Ford's Theater. Mary Lincoln screamed, and the audience was thrown into a state of panic and disbelief. Doctors were immediately summoned to the presidential box. They found President Lincoln slumped in his chair, mortally wounded. The bullet had entered the left side of his head and lodged behind his right eye. It was clear that the wound was fatal. Carefully, a group of soldiers and doctors carried the unconscious president out of the theater and across the street to a modest boarding house owned by William Peterson. He was laid diagonally on a bed in a small back room, as his tall frame was too long for the bed. Throughout that long and sorrowful night, government officials, cabinet members, and close friends kept a vigil by Lincoln's bedside. Mary Lincoln, overcome with grief, remained in an adjoining room. Doctors could do nothing to save him. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, never regained consciousness. He passed away at 7:22 on the morning of April 15th, 1865. Upon his death, Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, who had been present through much of the night, reportedly uttered the memorable words, "Now he belongs to the ages," or "Now he belongs to the angels." 1. News of the assassination spread rapidly across the nation via telegraph, plunging the country into profound shock and mourning. The joyous celebrations of the war's end were abruptly replaced by disbelief, outrage, and an outpouring of immense grief. Flags were lowered to half-mast, businesses closed, and public buildings were draped in black. People wept openly in the streets. The sense of loss was overwhelming. The man who had saved the Union, who had guided the nation through its greatest crisis, and who had proclaimed emancipation for millions, had been struck down at the very moment of triumph and reconciliation. A massive manhunt was immediately launched for John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators. Booth managed to evade capture for 12 days, but he was eventually cornered in a tobacco barn in Virginia and was shot and killed on April 26th. Several other conspirators were arrested, tried by a military commission, and either hanged or imprisoned. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was a national tragedy of unparalleled proportions. It not only cut short the life of a great leader, but also cast a dark shadow over the early years of Reconstruction, depriving the nation of his wisdom, compassion, and moral authority at a time when they were most desperately needed. A star had indeed been extinguished, and a nation mourned its fallen president with a depth of sorrow rarely witnessed. Chapter 20. The Enduring Light of Liberty. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April 1865, just as the Civil War was drawing to its agonizing close, plunged the United States into an unprecedented period of national mourning. The man who had steered the nation through its most perilous crisis, preserved the Union, and championed the cause of human freedom, was suddenly gone. Yet, even as the country grieved, the foundations of his legacy were already firmly established, a legacy that would not only shape the future of America, but also resonate as an enduring beacon of liberty and democratic ideals around the world for generations to come. Lincoln's most immediate and tangible achievement was the preservation of the United States as a single, indivisible nation. When he took office, the Union was already fracturing, with southern states seceding and forming their own confederacy. Through 4 years of brutal warfare, he remained steadfast in his conviction that the Union must be saved. He skillfully navigated immense political pressures, military setbacks, and moments of profound national despair, never wavering from this central goal. His leadership, his unwavering resolve, and his ability to articulate the profound importance of maintaining the last best hope of Earth, as he once called the American experiment, were crucial to the Union's ultimate victory. Inextricably linked to the preservation of the Union was his role in ending slavery. While he initially approached the issue with caution, prioritizing the restoration of the Union, his views evolved throughout the war. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, though limited in its immediate scope, fundamentally transformed the nature of the conflict into a war for human liberation. It was a bold and pivotal act that set the stage for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which, ratified shortly after his death, formally abolished slavery throughout the entire nation. Lincoln's journey on slavery, from a belief in its eventual gradual extinction to becoming the great emancipator, reflected both his moral growth and his pragmatic understanding of the war's necessities. Beyond these monumental achievements, Abraham Lincoln also profoundly redefined American democracy and the meaning of its core ideals. In speeches like the Gettysburg Address, he articulated a vision of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He elevated the sacrifices of the war by linking them to the very survival of government of the people, by the people, for the people. He imbued the struggle with a moral purpose that transcended the immediate political and military objectives, giving it a universal significance. His words helped to shape a new understanding of American nationhood, one more explicitly committed to the principles of equality and freedom for all. The impact of Lincoln's life and leadership extended far beyond his own lifetime. In the years following his death, he became an almost mythical figure in American memory, a symbol of integrity, wisdom, humility, and compassion. His journey from a humble log cabin to the White House embodied the American dream of self-improvement and opportunity. His ability to persevere through immense personal tragedy, the loss of children, the burdens of a wartime presidency, and his capacity for empathy and forgiveness, even towards his former enemies, resonated deeply with the American people. Monuments were erected in his honor, most notably the majestic Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., which stands as a powerful symbol of national unity and the enduring principles for which he stood. His words and actions continued to inspire movements for civil rights and social justice both within the United States and around the world. His steadfast opposition to the expansion of slavery and his eventual embrace of emancipation provided a powerful precedent for future struggles against oppression and inequality. Leaders and ordinary citizens alike have drawn inspiration from his eloquence, his moral courage, and his unwavering commitment to the ideals of liberty and justice. The enduring light of his legacy can be seen in the ongoing efforts to create a more inclusive and equitable society, one that truly lives up to the promise of its founding principles. Of course, like all historical figures, Abraham Lincoln was a complex man who lived in a complex time. Historians continue to debate various aspects of his presidency, his policies, and his personal beliefs. He was not without his flaws, and he made difficult choices in wartime that sometimes drew criticism. Yet, the overwhelming consensus remains that he was a leader of extraordinary vision and character, a man who rose to meet an unprecedented national crisis with remarkable wisdom and fortitude. His capacity for growth, his deep humanity, and his ultimate sacrifice for the nation he loved have secured his place as one of the most revered figures in American and world history. The story of Abraham Lincoln is more than just the biography of a president. It is a profound reflection on the enduring struggles for freedom, equality, and national unity. His life reminds us that even in the darkest of times, principled leadership and a commitment to higher ideals can guide a nation towards a new birth of freedom. The light he helped to ignite continues to illuminate the path for those who believe in the power of democracy and the inherent dignity of every human being. His legacy is not just a matter of historical record. It is a living inspiration.